whoever wants to answer can answer. So one of the questions is, how can Palestinian rights activists engage in joint struggle work without co-opting other struggles? And the second question is, any advice on organizing within an anti-racism framework? So if you want to answer both of these, either of these, feel free.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Number one is, how can Palestinian rights activists engage in joint struggle work without co-opting other struggles? And the second question is, any advice on organizing within an anti-racist framework?
I thought I didn't hear it, but it's a very complicated question. I did.
So I guess I'll try to start that one off. And I think one thing that's very useful, as I was talking about, is to have a sensitivity to the specific histories that different groups experience. So co-opting a struggle, and this happened actually in California during the No on Prop 8 movement, where a lot of LGBT organizations would say to African Americans, their churches or organizations, hey, look, like you a couple of decades ago didn't have like full rights. You know what this feels like. Why don't you support our issue? And sure, yes, like everyone needs rights, but that's not the way to go about approaching it. It shouldn't be something that's transactional or sort of manipulative of another people's struggle. And so, with particular reference to the Black community and relations with not just Palestinian but Arab communities more broadly, especially in places like the Detroit area, there is a dynamic where in a lot of these inner city neighborhoods, the people that own liquor stores or the lottery places are Arab Americans, and so solidarity with Palestine, which is so far away, might not make sense if the people that are sort of exploiting your community look like Palestinians, just to be very frank. And so for that particular community, it just needs to be aware of that history and be willing to acknowledge and confront it when trying to move into joint struggle. But I think on a broader level, it's important to recognize the historical experiences that every different group has had, how they might be the same, how they might vary. And yeah, that's my best shot for that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to?
So Had said something really key, I think, in the beginning of her address, which was that she's not saying that she understands what Black oppression looks like specifically, but she knows what oppression looks like. So to carry on from that, there's this kind of a mentality we need to toss out, which is that, okay, I can speak for you because I suffered in some way. You know, understanding our own personal narratives, our own personal histories, and how unique they are, without assuming that because of how unique or how overarchingly terrible they've been, or however you want to describe it, doesn't mean that we can step out of our circles and say, okay, I know what's best for you because I have accomplished this, and that, or I have suffered through this and that. Something that I noticed a lot, and that we had to kind of deconstruct in some of the divestment movements and searching for people to endorse our divestment resolutions, was if an organization refused to do so and they were an organization that stood for people of color or women or queer individuals or any other kind of oppressed group, you know, we get into our high horses and say, how dare they not support us? How dare they not stand in solidarity with us? Don't they understand what this means? And yes, it's frustrating to approach communities like this and be turned away, but at the same time, who am I as Palestinian American to go to, for example, a Native American organization and tell them what they have to be in solidarity for, when it's their own prerogative to decide that for themselves. So kind of abandoning this self-righteousness that we have of deciding what solidarity should be and who should be in solidarity is definitely.
I think I just want to go back to the point that I made earlier about, I think it also goes back to having personal relationships with people, because that goes a long way. And also, I mean, there are a lot of problems also, other than just the connecting struggles, but also there's a generational problem where within one group of people, there's like people deal with things differently. Their resource for information is different, and therefore their approach to it is different. And that's why there always needs to be personal connections. You need to build on that to be able to have a stronger relationship. That's.
Briefly address the second question, how can we engage in an anti-racist framework? So there's so many ways to answer that, and there's 1,000 different ways for 1,000 different groups and people and contexts. But one thing that came to mind is something that I observed in Tucson, actually, whether it was working in No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths on the U of A campus, putting up a mock wall that was the length of 4 football fields, 2 to 5, our 50,000 person campus, and create a crisis of movement and just throw the community into something of a crisis, deliberately. Or in terms of Unidos, in both of those instances, among the coalitional allies in the community are some of the most right-wing, lunatic, Israel-aligned groups that we know very well, Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Federation as 2 specific ones that we dealt with in Tucson. And if there'll be a group that comes forward in the community like Derechos Humanos, which is one of Tucson's oldest human rights groups working on other issues, the Jewish Federation will call them up, same thing with No More Deaths, and say, we're very offended, this statement you put on Palestine, we want to have a sit down with you. Or the wall, coming out to the wall on campus and saying there's absolutely no connection, we don't understand why you're making this connection, you're doing a disservice. The reason why they're part of the coalition is because groups like ADL and Jewish Federation, they publicly and strongly, in concrete ways, across the country, support a liberal framework on domestic issues. They oppose border militarization. ADL was in fact the first non-Latino group to come out and support ethnic studies. So if they see ethnic studies groups taking positions on Palestinian justice, they get very offended and they want to come and try and strong-arm the group. So trying to think about it and analyze it, what I realized, and others did as well, we tried to figure out how can we approach it in an anti-racist framework that's also educational. I realized that as we've seen Israel supporters here, as elsewhere, but especially in the United States, their decades of outreach strategies aren't complicated, but they're very effective as long as they can frame the issue as one of ethnic conflict. Jews and Arabs squabbling over something that none of us can understand, that'll ensure that they sow confusion and promise inaction by a broader cross-section of the public. So, to then confront these groups in full view of Latino allies and say, look, why you're supporting these issues that are opposing border militarization and supporting ethnic studies, but what about Israel's border militarization and furiously anti-immigrant sentiment and legislation and fear-mongering, hate-mongering in Israel and the treatment of the Palestinians? So it's one of those things where you sort of put them on the spot, and I've noticed that they're very confused once you reframe the issue like that. They don't know how to respond, they don't know how to react, and they're forced to react and in full view of their Latino allies, and they're forced to either express their true colors, or they're forced to change their policies. There's no escape. And to me, that showed me a very effective anti-racist framework and